Angelica was a black woman born and raised in a small town in South Carolina. Life there was often defined by tradition, with long-established families holding deep-rooted beliefs about community, family, and who belonged where. Despite this, Angelica had always been a spirited and independent woman who refused to let societal expectations dictate her life. Her world changed when she met James, a white man from one of the town's most respected families. James was everything Angelica admired in a partner: kind, intelligent, and unwavering in his affection for her. Their connection was immediate and powerful, a bond that seemed destined to overcome any obstacle. But from the moment they made their relationship public, tension began to simmer beneath the surface. James's mother, Mrs. Helen, was a woman of strong opinions and unyielding standards. To her, family reputation was everything, and she was fiercely protective of it. From the very first meeting, Mrs. Helen made it clear that she did not approve of Angelica. Her disapproval wasn't expressed directly at first, but in the cold glances she cast, the curt tone of her words, and the way she subtly excluded Angelica from conversations. At family gatherings, Mrs. Helen's true feelings began to surface. She often ignored Angelica, or made passive-aggressive remarks that only James seemed to notice. Angelica, determined to maintain her composure, responded with grace, though each interaction left her feeling more unwelcome. Mrs. Helen's dismissive attitude grew bolder over time. She began to make comments that were harder to overlook, questioning Angelica's intentions and openly doubting whether she could truly be part of their family. James was furious at his mother's behavior. He confronted her on several occasions, defending Angelica and insisting that their relationship was built on love and mutual respect. But Mrs. Helen was unmoved. For her, this union was an affront to the ideals she held about her family, and she refused to see past her prejudices. Despite the growing hostility, Angelica and James decided to move forward with their relationship. James proposed, and Angelica accepted, believing that their love could withstand the challenges ahead. The couple hoped that marriage would soften Mrs. Helen's heart and allow her to see the sincerity of their bond. However, their wedding day only solidified Mrs. Helen's disdain. Though she attended the ceremony, her presence was cold and disapproving. She avoided speaking to Angelica and made no effort to hide her discomfort. When the couple returned from their honeymoon, Mrs. Helen's behavior worsened. She actively sought to undermine Angelica, criticizing her at every opportunity and spreading unkind remarks within the community. For Angelica, the situation became unbearable. She had married James believing that their love would shield her from the storm of judgment and hostility. Yet, she found herself constantly battling feelings of inadequacy and rejection. The person who should have become a second mother to her was instead the source of her greatest pain. Each encounter with Mrs. Helen left Angelica questioning whether she could endure this toxic dynamic much longer. And so the seeds of conflict were sown, threatening to destroy not only Angelica's peace, but also the harmony of the family she had hoped to join. As the weeks turned into months, Angelica found herself increasingly consumed by the unrelenting tension between her and Mrs. Helen. Every family gathering became an ordeal. Mrs. Helen's remarks, once subtle, had grown sharper and more overt, slicing through Angelica's attempts to maintain her dignity. "She might have your name now," Mrs. Helen quipped one evening at dinner, "but that doesn't mean she understands what it means to be part of this family." The words stung, and Angelica's chest tightened as she struggled to keep her composure. She clenched her hands under the table, fighting back tears while James seethed beside her. He defended her, as always, but Mrs. Helen simply waved him off, as if Angelica's presence in the family was a passing inconvenience. That night, Angelica sat in silence, staring out the bedroom window while James tried to comfort her. Her mind churned with frustration and anger. She had never felt so unwanted, so undermined. The weight of it all bore down on her, threatening to crush the love and joy she once felt about her new life. And then, as if whispered by some dark corner of her mind, a thought surfaced. What if she weren't here anymore? At first, the idea horrified her. Angelica had always been a compassionate and thoughtful person, someone who believed in kindness and understanding. But Mrs. Helen's actions had pushed her to the edge, filling her heart with a bitterness she had never known. The thought of removing her tormentor permanently began to take root. Angelica found herself drawn to the idea with a mix of dread and curiosity. Late at night, while James slept, she began researching poisons and dangerous plants. Her searches were hesitant at first, as if she were testing the boundaries of her own conscience. She read about substances that were odorless and tasteless, substances that could be used without leaving a trace. It wasn't just the idea of ending Mrs. Helen's torment that drove her. It was the feeling of reclaiming control in a situation where she felt powerless. Every sharp word, every cold glare, replayed in her mind like a haunting melody, spurring her deeper into her dark thoughts. During the day, she tried to act normal, but the weight of her secret thoughts bore down on her. When Mrs. Helen's insults came, as they inevitably did, Angelica no longer felt the sting as deeply. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching events unfold from a distance. In her mind, she had already begun to imagine a life without Mrs. Helen, a life where she and James could finally be free of the woman's toxic presence. But as the days passed, Angelica began to feel the cracks in her resolve. Each time she envisioned going through with her plan, a wave of guilt would wash over her. This wasn't who she was. This wasn't the person her grandmother had raised her to be. Her grandmother had always been a pillar of wisdom in her life, teaching her the value of patience and kindness, even in the face of adversity. Angelica could almost hear her voice. Don't let someone else's bitterness take root in your heart. You're better than that. Angelica wrestled with these feelings daily, torn between her anger and her conscience. On some days, the thought of revenge felt like a balm for her wounds. On others, it filled her with shame. She started to avoid looking in the mirror for too long, fearing that she might not recognize the person staring back at her. One evening, after yet another humiliating dinner with Mrs. Helen, Angelica sat in the kitchen with James. He had seen the tears in her eyes and the strain on her face, and couldn't remain silent any longer. Angelica, he said softly, taking her hands in his. I see what this is doing to you. I hate her for the way she treats you, but I hate even more what it's doing to your spirit. Angelica hesitated, unsure if she should reveal the depths of her thoughts. But something in James's voice, in his unwavering love for her, broke through the walls she had built around her heart. I can't take it anymore, James, she admitted, her voice trembling. I've thought about doing something I shouldn't. I've thought about finding a way to make her stop. Permanently. James stared at her, stunned, but instead of recoiling, he pulled her into his arms. You're stronger than this, he whispered. We're stronger than this. Don't let her change who you are. We'll figure this out together. Angelica felt a mixture of relief and shame as she clung to James. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to acknowledge the darkness she had been harboring. In his arms, she felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this battle. James's words planted a new seed in her heart, the belief that they could face Mrs. Helen's cruelty without succumbing to it. The plan for revenge began to fade into the background, replaced by a determination to confront the situation in a way that wouldn't compromise her integrity. Angelica wasn't sure how they would move forward, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. She would find another way. She had to. During a family dinner one evening, Mrs. Helen was at her sharpest. Angelica could feel the tension building from the moment she walked in. The evening progressed as expected, with Mrs. Helen delivering veiled insults disguised as polite conversation. And how's that little hobby of yours going, Angelica? She asked with a sly smile. I suppose some people are better suited to simpler things. Angelica felt the familiar sting of humiliation but refused to let it overwhelm her. Instead, she responded calmly, her voice steady. Thank you for asking, Mrs. Helen. It's going quite well, actually. I've learned a lot about resilience. The subtle jab didn't go unnoticed, but Mrs. Helen only smirked, thinking she had won the exchange. James, visibly tense, took Angelica's hand under the table as a silent gesture of solidarity. What Mrs. Helen didn't know was that Angelica had started recording these interactions. That evening, the evidence she captured would become the final piece in a puzzle that revealed the depth of Mrs. Helen's hostility. Angelica didn't act impulsively. She carefully selected a few key moments from her recordings, ones that clearly demonstrated Mrs. Helen's unkindness. Then she shared them with a trusted friend of James's family, someone who held influence within their community. The friend was shocked and deeply disappointed. This wasn't the Mrs. Helen they thought they knew. Soon, the recordings began to circulate within the family's social circle. People who once admired Mrs. Helen began to see a different side of her. At first, Mrs. Helen was oblivious to the change in how people treated her. But as invitations dwindled and conversations grew colder, she began to sense something was wrong. The final blow came during a family gathering when one of her closest friends confronted her. "Helen, I've seen how you treat Angelica. It's disgraceful. I thought better of you." Mrs. Helen was left speechless. She had always prided herself on her reputation and standing in the community. Now it was crumbling around her, all because of the truth Angelica had revealed. For the first time, Mrs. Helen faced the consequences of her actions. She began to see herself through the eyes of others, and it wasn't a flattering picture. Slowly, the realization dawned on her. Her bitterness had not only hurt Angelica, but also driven a wedge between her and her son. Her behavior had isolated her, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. One evening, she called James and asked to meet. When Angelica arrived with him, Mrs. Helen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I've been wrong," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I thought I was protecting my family, but I see now that I've only caused harm. Angelica, I'm sorry for the way I've treated you. You didn't deserve it." Angelica listened, her emotions a mix of surprise, relief, and caution. She could see the sincerity in Mrs. Helen's apology, but the wounds ran deep. Forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but it was a step toward healing. Mrs. Helen's apology marked the beginning of a slow but genuine reconciliation. Though trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, her acknowledgement of her mistakes opened the door for change. Angelica, for her part, chose to forgive, not for Mrs. Helen's sake, but for her own peace of mind. As time passed, the family began to mend. Mrs. Helen worked to show through her actions that she was willing to change, while Angelica and James grew even closer through the trials they had endured together. Their love, tested by adversity, emerged stronger than ever. Angelica learned a valuable lesson through it all. True strength lies not in revenge, but in rising above the pain and finding a way to move forward with integrity and grace. In the weeks following her apology, Mrs. Helen began to reflect deeply on her behavior. The public fallout from Angelica's recordings had been humiliating, but it also forced her to confront the reality of her actions. She had always prided herself on being a matriarch, someone who upheld family values and maintained her community's respect. Now, she had to reckon with the fact that her actions had been anything but noble. Mrs. Helen reached out to a trusted confidant, a pastor who had long been a friend of the family. She sought his guidance, admitting her mistakes and asking for advice on how to rebuild the relationships she had damaged. His words were simple but profound. "You can't undo the past, but you can choose how to move forward. Change isn't about words, it's about action." Taking his advice to heart, Mrs. Helen began making small but meaningful gestures to show Angelica and James that she was trying to mend their relationship. She invited Angelica to lunch, not to lecture her, but to listen. She asked about Angelica's career, her passions, and her family, questions she had never bothered to ask before. While Angelica was initially wary of these efforts, she could see that they came from a genuine desire to rebuild trust. For Angelica, this was a period of profound growth. The ordeal had tested her resolve and her faith in herself, but it also revealed a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. She had stood up to Mrs. Helen, not with malice, but with truth, and she had emerged from the conflict with her integrity intact. Angelica began channeling her experiences into something positive. She joined a local organization that supported women navigating difficult family dynamics, sharing her story as an example of resilience. Her words resonated with others, inspiring them to confront their own challenges with courage and grace. At home, her relationship with James flourished. The two of them had faced adversity together and come out stronger. They began to discuss their future with excitement, envisioning a life where they could build their own traditions and create a home filled with love and understanding. Over time, Mrs. Helen's efforts began to bear fruit. Her gestures, though initially met with skepticism, started to feel more authentic. She attended events that were important to Angelica, including her work with the women's organization, and offered her support in small but meaningful ways. Slowly, Angelica began to let her guard down, allowing Mrs. Helen to take small steps toward redemption. James noticed the change too. He was proud of his mother for taking responsibility for her actions and grateful to Angelica for her willingness to give Mrs. Helen a chance. The family, once fractured, began to find a sense of unity. One of the most significant moments of Mrs. Helen's transformation came during a family gathering. It was a holiday dinner, the first one where Angelica felt truly welcomed. As the meal progressed, Mrs. Helen raised her glass for a toast. "I want to say something," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I haven't always been the person I should have been. I've hurt people I care about, and I've let my own fears and stubbornness get in the way of seeing the beauty in the people around me. Angelica, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my gratitude for your patience, for your grace, and for showing me what it means to be truly strong. You are not just a part of this family, you are its heart." The room fell silent, and then, one by one, people began to clap. Angelica felt a lump rise in her throat as she met Mrs. Helen's gaze. For the first time, she saw not the cold, judgmental woman she had known, but someone who was genuinely trying to change. That evening marked the beginning of a new chapter for their family. While the scars of the past didn't disappear overnight, they began to fade as the family worked together to build something new. Mrs. Helen continued to show her commitment to change, not just in words, but in the way she treated Angelica, with respect, kindness, and genuine affection. For Angelica, the experience became a testament to the power of perseverance and integrity. She learned that standing up for herself didn't mean resorting to anger or revenge. It meant holding firm to her values and allowing others the chance to grow and change. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led them all to a place of understanding and healing. As they sat around the table that evening, sharing stories and laughter, Angelica realized that she had found her place, not because she had fought for it, but because she had earned it through strength and grace. Angelica began sharing her story publicly. She spoke at local community centers, schools, and events, focusing on themes of resilience, understanding, and reconciliation. Her story wasn't just about conflict, it was about the power of truth, the possibility of change, and the importance of standing up for oneself without losing sight of compassion. During one of her talks, a woman in the audience approached her with tears in her eyes. "Your story could have been mine," she said. "Hearing how you navigated it gives me hope." These moments solidified Angelica's belief that her experience had the potential to spark real change. Angelica's voice reached beyond her town. With James's encouragement, she wrote a series of essays detailing her experiences. These essays were published in a national magazine, bringing her story to a wider audience. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from readers who saw themselves in Angelica's journey. People who had faced exclusion, misunderstanding, or rejection and found solace in her words. Angelica also turned her focus to local initiatives that promoted understanding and dialogue between people of different backgrounds. She helped establish a program that brought families together to share meals and stories, breaking down barriers and fostering connections. These events, which became known as community tables, quickly gained popularity, and Mrs. Helen, in a surprising turn of events, became one of their biggest advocates. At one event, Mrs. Helen stood up to speak. "I was someone who let my own biases cloud my judgment," she admitted. "But sitting at tables like this, sharing stories, I've learned that the world is so much richer when we embrace our differences. Angelica taught me that, and I'm grateful every day for her patience and strength." The room erupted in applause, and Angelica felt a swell of pride, not just in herself, but in the journey Mrs. Helen had undertaken to become a better person. Angelica and James's work didn't stop there. Together, they launched an organization aimed at creating educational resources for families navigating cultural or personal conflicts. Their mission was simple, but profound: to empower people to confront misunderstandings with empathy and courage. The organization held workshops, created mentorship programs, and partnered with schools to teach young people about the importance of communication and understanding. Angelica and James became regular speakers at conferences, where they shared their insights and strategies for overcoming division. Their efforts began to inspire similar initiatives in neighboring towns and beyond. Through this work, Angelica found a new sense of purpose. The pain she had endured no longer felt like a burden. It had become a catalyst for transformation. She had grown into a confident and compassionate leader, someone who could turn adversity into opportunity and inspire others to do the same. Her relationship with Mrs. Helen continued to evolve as well. While they could never fully erase the past, they built a relationship rooted in mutual respect and understanding. Mrs. Helen became a vocal supporter of Angelica's work, often accompanying her to events and even hosting some at her own home. For Angelica, this transformation was the ultimate victory. It wasn't about winning against Mrs. Helen. It was about creating a space where they could both grow and change. The impact of Angelica's efforts began to ripple outward. Families who attended the community tables spoke about how the experience had changed their perspectives. Students who participated in the mentorship programs went on to create inclusive spaces in their own communities. Angelica's organization expanded its reach, forming partnerships with national nonprofits that shared their mission. One evening, as Angelica stood in front of a packed auditorium to deliver a keynote speech, she reflected on how far she had come. The woman who once felt isolated and powerless now stood as a beacon of hope for others. Her story was no longer just her own. It had become a movement. As Angelica and James walked home that evening, hand in hand, they talked about the future. They dreamed of expanding their organization, traveling to other communities, and continuing to share their message. Their love, forged in the fires of adversity, had become a source of strength not just for them, but for countless others. Angelica looked up at the stars and smiled. She had faced rejection, pain, and anger, but she had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Her journey was a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of change, a legacy she would carry forward for the rest of her life.